President Benjamin Harrison signed the Pension Act in 1890. It revolutionized Civil War pensions because it gave them based on disability and need rather than direct service connection. It granted monthly payments of $6 to $12. It was a lot more back then than it sounds today. To veterans with 90 days of service who are unable to perform manual labor, and to their widows and dependents. So there was the non-service connection. You didn't have to prove your disability was caused by your military service, which was a big departure from previous policy. It required at least 90 days of honorable service in the Union Army or Navy, so not the Confederacy. It covered disabilities preventing manual labor and expanded to include widows, minor children, and dependent parents. The number of pensioners increased significantly, with over 900,000 individuals on the rolls by 1893. It passed following pressure from the Grand Army of the Republic, which was an organization of Union veterans, after Grover Cleveland vetoed a similar bill to this in 1887. And again, payments were from $6 to $12 per month, which was a lot for 1890. And this act, it's considered a precursor to modern social welfare. And it shifted the burden of care for veterans onto the federal government, which hadn't been the case to that point in time. President Harrison, who was a Civil War vet, appointed a man named James Tanner, his nickname was Corporal, who was also a disabled vet, as the Commissioner of Pensions, and he nearly sapped the federal surplus paying out the pensions. Tanner lost both his legs at the Second Battle of Bull Run. He was a very prominent member of the Grand Army of the Republic, and he had campaigned heavily for Harrison. And his appointment was seen by the public as a reward for his political support and an assurance to veterans as well that their support and that their claims would be handled generously. So this is a cartoon of the Pension Act. This, I think, is supposed to be Tanner filling the pockets of veterans with cash, the surplus money. So the pension costs over a 4-year period there rose from $81 million to $135 million. The pensions earned the Republicans the support of the Grand Army of the Republic. In 1890, Harrison also passes the Sherman Antitrust Act, hoping to reduce the power of corporate monopolies. This was the first federal law that seriously took on the monopolistic business practices that had been going on in this country. It was trying to preserve free market competition. It was trying to protect consumers from the abuses of massive industrial trusts. There were two big provisions. Section 1 was the restraint of trade. It declared illegal every contract, combination, or conspiracy that unreasonably restrains interstate or foreign trade. Section 2 prohibited the act of monopolizing or attempting or conspiring to monopolize any part of trade or commerce, and it was enforced through criminal and civil penalties, such as fines and imprisonment, through treble damages, which means that private parties injured by antitrust violations were authorized to sue for 3 times the actual damages that they were sustained. And the enforcement agencies, the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission, are the primary federal enforcers. It was initially weak. I mean, as all things are that start out, the act was largely ineffective for the first decade against industrial giants that it was supposed to protect uh, citizens of the United States from, because of narrow judicial interpretations like United States versus E.C. Knight Company, an 1895 case which ruled that manufacturing was not commerce. But it eventually finds its feet and is foundational. 1890, also the McKinley Tariff Act boosted rates to 48.4%, which are the highest levels yet in the history of the country. Farmers get massively hurt by tariffs, and as a result, the Republicans lose many seats in the next elections. So the Second Industrial Revolution. Rural districts are being studded with villages. The villages are growing into cities. The cities are stretching out long arms of suburbs. The railroad industry became a dominant government-supported economic force in the late 1800s, creating jobs, creating millionaires, a lot of millionaires, and providing an infrastructure that further bound the nation together. We don't need to go on Wikipedia. So the railroad industry was absolutely the biggest American industry of the 1800s. We were trying to connect the East Coast to the West, and it was a big and expensive venture. Created a lot of jobs, the most jobs, created an enormous amount of economic growth. Congress subsidized these railroad companies heavily with both money and land. But they were reluctant to regulate this giant industry just simply because of laissez-faire economics. We were still in the of laissez-faire, government hands-off, the economy times. So railroads, they opened up new markets for American businesses. They gave land value because cities grew along railroad lines. And land speculators gambled on where the railroad might be built, and land speculators would then have the opportunity to sell the land they bought to the railroad and make a profit. The West was opened up entirely by railroads. Western farmers could send their goods back east, but they were also at the mercy of railroad industry prices. The Great Pacific Railway is commenced. Immigration will soon pour into these valleys. 10 millions of immigrants will settle in this golden land in 20 years. This is the grandest enterprise under God. Very romantic vision of the opening of the West of the United States. When the South seceded, the North could build transcontinental railroads where it wanted. So companies like the Union Pacific jumped on that. 1862, Congress passes the Pacific Railway Act, paying Union Pacific Railroad to begin westward expansion from Omaha, Nebraska to California, which it did. Here we see Union Pacific Railroad workers, mostly Irish immigrants. They put down an average of 5 to 10 miles of track in a day. Couldn't even imagine. If you just look at that, I couldn't imagine that kind of operation. And from California, the Central Pacific Railroad built eastward through the Rocky Mountains using mostly Chinese laborers. So in 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad was done. It met in Ogden, Utah, and this is where east met west. It's a little grainy, but maybe you can see a little better. Yeah, this is the spot where it connected. 1,775 miles of track laid. Utah, the crossroads of the West. And by 1900, there were 5 transcontinental railroads built. Union Pacific, Northern Pacific Railway, Great Northern Railway, the Santa Fe, and Southern Pacific lines. Technologies helped advance the railroad industry, like steel rails, Westinghouse air brakes, which made the cars a little safer to operate, and telegraph lines, so stations could let stations further down the track know if maybe there was a blizzard, if a car was delayed, if there was some bad weather, if something was wrong with the tracks. Made things a lot safer, a lot faster. The Pullman Palace cars were built. These were real luxurious sleeping cabins for travelers. I mean, the railroad industry really had a monopoly on travel for a good long stretch of our history. So Gustavus Swift developed the refrigerated train car to transport meat and perishable items. So that helped farmers and other food manufacturers get their food from place to place and maybe be able to transport it a little further down the railroad line than they otherwise would have in the past. The railroads stitched our nation together. They created huge job markets for all sorts of labor and other skills-based jobs, helped spread industrialization throughout our land, and stimulated mining and agriculture in the West. 1883, the railroads directly led to creation of 4 national time zones instead of each city with its own time zone. You needed to be able to reliably say when a train was getting in, and we couldn't do that with the hodgepodge of time zones we had going on before this. So railroading and government regulation. Railroad companies had shady relations with politicians and abused America's farmers, with sky-high rates leading the government to begin regulating this industry that was so vital to the health of the American economy. And just a word more about time zones before we continue. Before 1883, we didn't have a standardized time zone, like I said. I looked it up. It was estimated that there were at least 144 different local times in use. So this was no way to run a railroad. You needed just kind of a few time zones to be able to tell the schedule and determine when trains were coming in, since, again, these railroads were so vital to the health and development of our country. So railroads made millionaires and the millionaire class. There were also billionaires, and most of them came from railroad money, as you can see, to the tune of 40%. Second highest, finance, and then inherited wealth. So there were American billionaires in 1900. Here we have a cartoon, The American Frankenstein. The railroads created a monster. These rich men, who made their money off the exploitation of the masses. Certainly this artist's interpretation of what that was. So some very wealthy railroad owners used their immense wealth to influence politicians and take advantage of Western farmers, ranchers, and miners who depended on the railroad. So if you made your livelihood, and your livelihood depended on getting your goods from point A to point B, and the railroad was the only way to do it, you were really at the mercy of these guys, and you were really kind of hoping against hope that these railroad tycoons would stick to their word, that rates would stay the same, that they treat you fairly, and that really wasn't the case. In this cartoon kind of gives it away. Consolidation train, extortion, bribery, usurpation, oppression, and so on and so forth. Hollis Huntington, lobbyist, and Leland Sanford, who was the ex-governor of California. They used their political ties to secure government contract for Transcontinental Railroad. The railroads were sometimes corrupt, like the Pacific Railway Company. They overcharged the government $23 million in the Credit Mobilier scandal, which would be $417,076,559 in 2015 dollars, which would be even more in 2026 dollars. Jay Gould embezzled millions from the railroad companies. Gould ranks among the most famous robber barons of the Gilded Age. These robber barons were wealthy people who acquired their wealth using questionable, corrupt, or downright criminal methods. Gould is one of the most sinister figures that have ever flitted bat-like across the vision of the American people, says Joseph Pulitzer, a newspaper publisher who a famous prize is named after. Cornelius Vanderbilt in 1853 says, "You have undertaken to cheat me. I won't sue you, for the law is too slow. I will ruin you." Stock watering was happening. Railroad companies overinflated the worth of their stock and sold them at huge profits. And eventually these railroad owners created defensive alliances to show profits. And these were the first trusts or pools. America was very slow at combating railroad abuses. The owners of these railroads, you have to remember, had millions of dollars. They had politicians, judges, lobbyists, lawyers, bought and paid for. They could pretty much do as they like, and the government had enabled it up to a point when they finally said enough is enough and we need to start doing something about this. The Grange was an alliance of farmers, and they were formed specifically to combat railroad corruption and monopolies, because farmers, big or small, depended on railroads to ship their goods to markets all over the country. And in the absence of federal regulation, and with growing pressure from farmers, states began regulating the railroads. And this was a fight. Like in Wabash versus Illinois, the Supreme Court ruled that states cannot regulate the railroads because the states can't regulate interstate commerce or commerce that is going from state to state. They can regulate commerce that occurs within their state borders, but it's within the purview of the federal government. This is the basic concept of American federalism. It's within the purview of the federal government to regulate commerce that crosses state lines. In 1887, the Interstate Commerce Act passed that allows the federal government to better regulate the railroad industry by giving them the authority. They banned rebates and pools. They required railroads to publish rates openly so they can't cheat customers. They forbade unfair discrimination against shippers. They banned charging more for short haul than long haul. The Interstate Commerce Commission was established to oversee the railroad industry. And the original task of the commission was to ensure that railroad rates were just and reasonable and to outlaw discriminatory practices like rebates to large shippers, which we were just discussing on the previous slide, and higher charges for short distance hauls. It expanded its scope over time to include having jurisdiction over nearly all forms of interstate surface transportation. And this is down the road a bit, obviously, from the time we're talking about, including trucking, bus lines, oil pipelines, and even telephone and telegraph services until the FCC was formed in 1934. The ICC enforced railroad safety standards until 1966 and managed labor disputes within the interstate transport sector, and it was eventually abolished. So the ICC was not effective. Overall, the act was not really enforced, but Congress was at least trying to regulate the business for society's benefit. The commission is or can be made of great use to the railroads. It satisfies the popular clamor for a government supervision of railroads. At the same time, that supervision is almost entirely nominal. The part of wisdom is not to destroy the commission, but to utilize it, says Richard Olney, lawyer for railroads and future attorney general. The trust titan emerges. So given the laissez-faire system of the time, Gilded Age corporations freely devised many ways to eliminate competition to form various forms of monopolies and maximize profits. It's all about profits. In some ways, the Gilded Age America was a plutocracy, which means the rule of the wealthy. The richest people in history. Gilded Age, John D. Rockefeller, $189.7 billion. Cornelius Vanderbilt, Gilded Age, $150.6 billion. Henry Ford, $140.9 billion. H.L. Hunt, $122 billion. Andrew Carnegie, $120 billion. Andrew Carnegie financed the building of the library in my town here of Lincoln. John Jacob Astor, $103.4 billion. Bill Gates, modern day $100 billion. Stephen Gerrard, 95.1. Sam Walton, 82.5. Stephen Van Rensselaer, 95.1 billion. Most of these people are Gilded Age folk. Frederick Weyerhaeuser, number 11 in timber. Alexander Stewart in trade. Jay Gould, we discussed railroad. Marshall Field, department store. Hetty Green, The Witch of Wall Street, number 18. Number 20, Andrew Mellon. Again, most of these are Gilded Age people. George Pullman, whose cars we saw earlier. All these people in all these industries in this particular period of time in American history. And a lot of these people, I mean, the families aren't in the news every day, but I mean, the Rockefellers are still around. Carnegie, I believe there are still Carnegies around somewhere, J.P. Morgan. These families didn't disappear. This wealth didn't just evaporate into nothing. So industrialists thrived with government's laissez-faire approach to business, using various methods to eliminate competition and maximize their own profits. And business leaders consolidated corporations into trusts and holding companies, thereby creating monopoly. This is Mr. Carnegie. He introduced the use of vertical integration. So a company controlled all aspects of an industry. He says the eighth wonder of the world is this: 2 pounds of iron and stone purchased on the shores of Lake Superior and transported to Pittsburgh. 2 pounds of coal mined in Connellsville and manufactured into coke and brought to Pittsburgh. 1/2 pound of limestone mined east of the Alleghenies and brought to Pittsburgh. A little manganese ore mined in Virginia and brought to Pittsburgh. And these 4.5 pounds of material manufactured into 1 pound of solid steel and sold for 1 cent. That's all that need be said about the steel industry. Money to be made with vertical integration. Rockefeller mastered horizontal integration. which was taking over or merging with competitors to establish a monopoly, like the Standard Oil Company. It brooks no competition. Its settled policy and firm determination is to crush out all who may be rash enough to enter the field against it. It hesitates at nothing in the accomplishment of this purpose. Horizontal and vertical. Please pause the video and study this chart. It's really very good at explaining the difference here between the two concepts. So again, pause the video, take a look, make sure you understand the difference here between vertical and horizontal integration. So Rockefeller established interlocking directories, placing his own men on the board of directors of rival companies. And corporate lawyers used the 14th Amendment to defend trusts, arguing corporations were big people entitled to their properties. And judges would usually agree with this interpretation. Ellis Island and immigration. This is just a remarkable place. I was fortunate enough to visit when I was younger, and it certainly leaves an impression on you about what probably many of our ancestors had to do and deal with and endure to come to this country. 100 million Americans can trace their ancestry, including me, to immigrants who arrived in the U.S. through Ellis Island, so 1/3 of the population. Industrialization offered big opportunities for Southern and Eastern Europeans who came to the United States in the late 1800s. But like earlier immigrant groups, they were met by the hostilities of a largely nativist American people, so we didn't trust them. First it was the Irish, then it was the Italians, so on and so forth. There will always, throughout American history, seems to be some boogeyman. So after the 1880s, Eastern and Southern Europeans came to our country in great numbers. And unlike Western Europeans coming from countries like Great Britain or France, these new immigrants had little history with representative government. They're largely coming from dictatorial regimes, maybe absolute monarchies, nothing like we have or had. And they were largely unskilled and largely very poor compared to their Western European counterparts. America was seen as a land of luxury and excess by Europeans, which was a dream that the industrialists of the age encouraged because they wanted cheap laborers, which they got in droves. America was known to foreigners as the land where you'd get rich. There's gold on the sidewalk, all you have to do is pick it up. A literal El Dorado. So this is a very famous photo, Mulberry Street in Little Italy. So Mulberry Street, it was historically recognized as the main street in Manhattan's Little Italy neighborhood. It served as the cultural and commercial heart of the Italian immigrant experience in New York City. The street was dominated in the 1890s by Italian immigrants who established a dense network of tenement housing, bakeries, cafes, and open-air markets. It was famously documented by what you're looking at right now by Jacob Riis in his 1890 book, How the Other Half Lives. His photographs of the overcrowded Mulberry Bend helped spark major urban housing reforms. And the street became a world unto itself where immigrants maintained traditions through regional enclaves and religious festivals like the Feast of San Gennaro, which remains an annual tradition until today. immigrants sought to Americanize but also maintain their unique identities. And I'd encourage you again just to pause the video and really study this picture. It's quite remarkable. You see a little bit of everything. The federal government did little to help immigrants assimilate. Immigrants were often controlled by bosses like Boss Tweed in New York City, giving them jobs and shelter in return for political support. So Boss Tweed would take them into the political machine and use them that way. Not what they came to America for, I would bet. Nativism reemerges in the 1880s, and a fear that immigrants would spoil the WASP, meaning white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, which was what America predominantly was up to that point, tradition of America. Immigrants were blamed for cities' problems. They were blamed for really everything. Unions hated them for accepting low wages and undermining the contracts that they had worked out between their memberships and the industries they worked for. The American Protective Association, the APA, was against immigration and their role in undermining unions. Congress also passed laws banning poor people, yes, you've heard me right, and criminals, which were the first laws ever restricting immigration in the United States history. One such was the Immigration Act of 1882, which was signed by President Chester Arthur on August 3rd, 1882. It was the first general federal immigration law. It specified targeted individuals deemed undesirable or a potential burden on the state. There was a public charge provision. The act barred entry to any person unable to take care of him or herself without becoming a public charge, so needing welfare. This LPC, likely to become a public charge clause, was used to exclude the poor, the disabled, the sick, and even single pregnant women. There were excluded categories under this law in addition to the poor. The law banned convicts, lunatics, and idiots. And yes, that is what the law said, lunatics and idiots. There was a head tax. It imposed a 50-cent head tax on every non-citizen arriving at U.S. ports to fund the cost of regulating immigration and deporting those people who were excluded under the law. And there was a deportation clause, so federal law authorized the expulsion of certain immigrants, making it the fiscal responsibility of the ship that brought them to return them to their home country. There was also the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. This law was the first in U.S. history to ban a specific ethnic and class-based group from entering the country. So there was a laborer ban. It suspended the immigration of all Chinese laborers, both skilled and unskilled, for a period of 10 years. There were wealth exceptions. Poor laborers were banned, but the law allowed entry for non-laborers like merchants, teachers, students, and diplomats who could prove their status and prove they wouldn't be a burden to the state. There was also a citizenship ban, which prohibited federal and state courts from granting citizenship to Chinese immigrants already residing in the United States. The increased migrations from Asia occurred, so people were moving to cities or rural and boomtown areas of the West. Asians faced severe discrimination. Nativist politician Dennis Kearney of San Francisco encouraged citizens to terrorize Chinese people. So the Chinese Exclusion Act starts to become enforced in earnest in 1883. It was signed and passed in 1882, but in 1883 you start to see the creation of detailed case files for Chinese immigrants. Historians also define 1883 as the start of the restriction period, which lasted about 1883 to about 1889, during which the federal government first began strictly policing the new race-based categories of labor versus exempt classes, the exempt classes again being like merchants and students, and the law was expanded. So the original 1882 Act was a 10-year moratorium that was later strengthened and extended by subsequent laws like the Scott Act of 1888 and the Geary Act of 1892. So the 1882 Act remained the primary legal framework for excluding Chinese immigrants and was only repealed in 1943. Notice communist, nihilist, socialist, Fenian, and hoodlum welcome but no admittance to Chinamen. Not really our finest hour. In 1885, there was a law passed banning importation of foreign workers. There were literacy tests for immigrants proposed, and those were passed in 1917. And the U.S. eventually began addressing immigrant slum conditions. Jane Addams in 1889 founded Hull House in Chicago to teach immigrants basic skills and language to survive in the country. Immigrants took advantage of career opportunities even in the face of widespread social prejudice, and this was critical to American economic growth, that these people took advantage of those opportunities. We'll pick up here next.